Thanks very much, Liz. Right, I'm just going to try and share my screen. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. Okay. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me tonight to be part of this event. Really appreciate that. As Liz has already said, I'm going to be trying to talk about some of the links between climate justice and racial justice, and about how the concept of climate reparations is directly linked to the historical struggle for reparations for African enslavement and colonialism. So I've already mentioned that I'm representing the INISAR, which I helped to co-found with Joyce Hope Scott from Boston University, Esther Stanford-Kosei, who's a reparationist and juris consult here in the UK, and Kofi Mabuli-Klou, who are both from the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe. We established that network in 2017. So I'm going to really talk very briefly about some of these issues that warrant much more time, but I'll do my best. So I'm going to look at the historical links between racial and climate injustice. I'm going to provide a very brief history of the international social movement for African reparations based in the UK, and particularly its struggle around planet repairs. And I'll talk about what that term means. And then I'm going to look at the work that the INISAR has been doing within the broader reparatory justice movement before thinking about how tackling racism and calling for reparations have fed into the policy of the Green Party and its work with other political parties at local and national government levels. So I'm sure many of you know this, but let's just not go forward before remembering like the history that we're talking about here, and the leading role that Britain played in what we term the transoceanic trafficking and enslavement of African peoples rather than the slave trade, for reasons that we can discuss later if that's of interest. But Britain's involvement in slavery began in 1562 with the voyages of John Hawkins and Francis Drake, and ended officially at least in 1833 with the Abolition Act. According to the statistics that we have available, it was, or Britain was responsible for outfitting the second highest number of voyages, nearly 31% of them, and for capturing and enslaving, again, the second highest number of African peoples behind the Portuguese, well over 3 million. And these statistics are based on the available data that suggests that around 12.5 million Africans were enslaved, although activists and others have estimated that the figure is much, much higher than that, closer to 28 million people. But I think the question that I'm trying to answer here today is, what has this history, and of course the connected history of colonialism, got to do with climate change, and why should reparations for past human abuses and crimes against humanity matter to everyone today? So the links between slavery and colonialism, capitalism and climate change are well established, but they're not always well explained, particularly in the public domain. I'm going to be quite simplistic in what I'm saying, but to summarise, Britain's involvement in slavery and colonialism alongside the other European imperial powers allowed it to accrue a wealth vast enough to fund its own industrial revolutions and to develop the modern system of capitalism that survives today. So I've got a quotation up there on the slide by Sir Hilary Beckles, who's one of the most well-known reparations today, who says African enslavement in the West Indies was the base from which the British exported the financially successful model of African enslavement to the rest of its colonised world, making global the ideas and methods that were critical to colonial modes of capital accumulation. Now, slavery earned people a lot of money, and the ideas and methods that Beckles is talking about was based on labour extraction and exploitation for maximum profit, land clearances for monocropping and mass production, and the development of a new banking system based on credit. It resulted in the accumulation of riches and powers, to cite Arraoz, for many enslavers, which was accompanied by the project to appropriate nature to render it profitable and subservient to the needs of industry. In other words, it meant reducing people, particularly those with darker skin tones, to nothing more than chattel, while reconceptualizing the world as a vast resource for wealth extraction. So scientists have dated the beginning of significant changes to our climate and the release of large amounts of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases directly to this relatively recent period of history and its industrialization. So when we think about the harms committed to those who were enslaved and colonized over the past 500 years, it can't really be thought of separately from the harms committed to the physical environment as part of that process. The legacies of this history mean that today we're living in what is broadly seen, or what we broadly see as the global South. It's people living in the global South who are suffering the most from the impacts of our climate emergency. So this history of injustice continues today. So it's not possible to provide a full account of the international social movement for African reparations, but it is important to recognise, as Liz pointed out in the introduction, that this is a history that has its origins in the very beginning of the European-led transoceanic trafficking and enslavement of Africans. Now, just to provide an example from the UK, one of the earliest known examples for calls for reparation can be traced to the Sons of Africa, and one of its key protagonists, Otabako Guano, an enslaved African originally from the Fante village of Ajumaku in present-day Ghana. So the Sons of Africa movement was formed in London in 1797 by Kuguano and Alado Equiano, whose name you might well recognise from his extraordinary narrative, and that's the man who's depicted here on the slide. Now, these men, as Esther Stanford-Cossé writes, were not just abolitionists, they were also reparationists, who called for adequate reparation and restitution for the injuries caused to enslaved peoples. In more recent history, reparations campaigns have been led by community activists, movements and networks, and I've listed some of them here: the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, the Stop the Maangamizi We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign, the Global African People's Parlement, the African Emancipation Day Reparations March Committee, and the INASAR as well. I'm just going to point to a few key points about this UK movement based on the work of Esther Stanford-Cossé. So first of all, it's a movement that looks to its leadership from the African continent and is interested in reconnecting to and learning from Indigenous African communities and traditions, which includes how they engage with nature and ecology. The second point is that it's international and intergenerational in focus, having its roots in the long history of Pan-Africanism that looks to unite people, African people, politically and ideologically across the world to contest, among other things, different forms of Afrophobia and racism. And it's intersectional, and that's important today as we think about the meaning of the scope of reparations. Reparation is never narrowly defined. It's informed by the need for holistic repair. Am I drawing on my slide? Is that me? Okay, so reparations are often misunderstood politically and by the media as simply a paycheck to individual claimants. But if we look at the definition provided by the UN Basic Principles and Guidelines on a Right to Remedy and Reparation, it includes a vast swathe of approaches to reparatory justice, including restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. So we can see that the need to repair operates at multiple levels, from the psychological and the spiritual, all the way through to the social and the economic. A holistic and intersectional approach, like that adopted by UK-based reparationists, means understanding the interconnections between race and class and gender, and how these create multiple and complex forms of discrimination that also need repair. So of course, this is not a simple process. There is no one size fits all. And the complexity arises from the multidimensional nature and longevity of the harms that we're talking about. It requires a multifaceted approach that cannot be simply reduced to economic compensation or a paycheck. So if we look at one aspect of the need for repair that concerns all of us, and that is planet repairs. So I've put a quotation up on the slide there by the Uruguayan author and journalist Eduardo Galeano, who says the invading civilizations, we could put civilizations in inverted commas, confused ecology with idolatry. Communion with nature was a sin worthy of punishment. nature was a fierce beast that had to be tamed and punished so that it could work as a machine, placed at our service forever and ever. Nature, which was eternal, owed us slavery. So I think this quotation really speaks to the way that those who believed in the need to oppress their fellow humans by enslaving and colonizing them for their own profits were supported by the kind of colonial thinking that imagined indigenous and Aboriginal peoples to be lower down the evolutionary chain. This is the theory of social Darwinism, of course. Now, these racist beliefs were supported by pseudosciences that created the idea that humanity is divided into human races, an idea that's since been completely debunked. But the idea that we were all on some sort of path to evolution towards the pinnacle of white Europeanness justified the denigration and in some cases the eradication of African and other indigenous social systems and beliefs through forms of cultural genocide, which is what Galeano is talking about. He's saying that there was no value given to indigenous understandings about our relationship to the natural world, which were dismissed as blasphemous idolatry. So cultural genocide has gone hand in hand with ecocide. And that, I would argue, has left us today in our so-called modern world with a very limited set of tools that are deemed viable ways to actually tackle the climate emergency. These tend to be technological solutions, many of which require digging up the earth to reach rare earth minerals and digging further into our Mother Earth and into our Mother Ocean. So Planet Repairs as a theory and a practice seeks to reverse this process. It's a concept that emerged from indigenous practices in Latin America and in Africa. So if we go back to 1991 and the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in Washington, they drafted and adopted 17 principles of environmental justice. And these principles serve to challenge white-centered conceptualizations of the environment, which tend to separate the human from nature following enlightenment-based thinking. So rather than being thought of as separate issues, they argued that the environment is woven into an overall framework and understanding of social, racial, and economic justice. They stated that to build a national and international movement of all peoples of colour to fight the destruction and taking of our lands and communities, we need to establish our spiritual interdependence to the sacredness of our Mother Earth, to respect and celebrate each of our cultures, languages and beliefs about the natural world and our roles in healing ourselves, to ensure environmental justice, to promote economic alternatives which would contribute to the development of environmentally safe livelihoods, and to secure our political, economic and cultural liberation that has been denied for over 500 years of colonization and oppression, resulting in the poisoning of our communities and land and the genocide of our peoples. So likewise, the African-centered concept of planet repairs is captured by the Stop the Maangamizi struggle against both ecocide and genocide. And they highlight the nexus of reparatory, environmental and cognitive justice and call for the need to repair holistically our relationship with and inseparability from the earth, environment and the pluriverse, giving due recognition to indigenous knowledges, in contrast to this Western-centric Enlightenment ideals that separated humanity from nature and thereby justified exploitation for capital accumulation. So the inseparability of racial and climate justice has been at the heart of our work in INISAR. We're an independent and voluntary reparations consultancy and advocacy group that works across different communities to advance the struggle for reparations and other forms of transitional justice for the enslavement and genocide of peoples of African descent. So in 2020, when the pandemic hit, as we all remember, we teamed up with the Green Party and Stop the Maangamizi We Charge in Genocide Ecocide campaign to assist with getting a motion passed at national level for the Green Party. So this resulted in the Green Party becoming the first major national party to commit to seeking reparatory justice for the transoceanic trafficking and enslavement of Africans. And members voted overwhelmingly in favour with 94%, and that was in October 2020. So this was a motion that was passed by Green councillors Cleo Lake, who's on the slide there at the back, and Scott Ainsley from Lambeth, and it was supported by Greens of Colour and Young Greens. And it commits the Green Party to calling on Parliament to establish an all-party parliamentary commission of inquiry for truth and reparatory justice. So that national move followed on from a similar motion that was the first of its kind that was passed in Lambeth Council. Again, this time was led by Green Party councillor Scott Ainsley, which is home to the largest African Caribbean population in the UK. And then we had more success in March 2021. Another reparations motion was passed in Bristol. This time is a collaboration between Cleo Lake, a Green Party councillor, and the Labour mayor there, Marvin Rees. We're now trying to do the same in Liverpool and in Lancaster. We've run a number of training workshops looking at the links between reparations movements and planet repairs for councillors, particularly as they attempt to gain cross-party support for these issues, which is not always the easiest of things to do. And I put on the slide some FAQs that we created and a pack that we developed to help with political campaigning at local levels. If anybody's interested, I'm more than happy to pass those on. Okay, and then the final thing I wanted to point out was that the local level has been complemented at national government level, although this is still very much in its infancy. On the 20th of October 2021, the Stop the Mangamizi campaign successfully lobbied for the first all-party parliamentary group on African reparations to be created. And this is now under the leadership of the MP, Belle Ribeiro Addy, who's on the slide there. And INASAR again is contributing to the work that they're trying to do. I just want to finish with one of the key issues in terms of recognition by quoting Kofi Klou from PARCO and Stop the Mangamizi, and also the co-founder of INASAR, who noted that it's taken almost 3 decades of painstaking campaigning endeavours to raise consciousness enough for such results to be the works of not a few, but the many. So going forwards, as more and more people take up this idea of planet repairs and what it means, I think it's really important to keep paying tribute to this long history of reparations struggle, rooted in reparations for African enslavement and other indigenous forms of struggle, and to draw from the experiences and learnings that we have right here in the UK. Many thanks, I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Nicola. That was really interesting and informative, and really interesting to link it up to things that have happened here already. Perhaps there's some ideas of things that some of us can continue to do on that front. So now I'm going to hand over to Lumumba. Lumumba, I'll just introduce you with a slightly longer introduction than the original one. So Lumumba Di-Aping is from South Sudan, is a long-standing climate justice advocate, and he's also been an ambassador to the UN for Sudan, he's probably best known, I guess, for being the chief negotiator for the G77 plus China group of developing countries at the UN climate talks in Copenhagen in 2009, which many of us will remember not very fondly, the talks, that is, where he famously called out countries in the global north for colonizing the sky. So Lumumba, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me.
We can, thank you. Yep.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for Climate Justice for inviting me to today. I equally want to take this opportunity to comment the lecture or the speech of Nicola, because definitely in terms of the definition of aspects, she has covered everything. She has made my job reasonably easy. I'm going to concentrate on the intersection between reparation, or climate reparation, and climate justice, and their relevance today. Of course, as we meet here today, we need to remember that it has become self-evident that the global efforts since Rio Conference in 1972 and the signing of the UNFCCC, the convention in March 1994, which aimed at preventing dangerous human interference with climate system, have been decidedly subverted by the global North establishment, economic elites and industrial complexes, and denialist intelligentsia. Effectively, they have turned that drive to addressing climate change danger into destruction by inaction. And this matters. The efforts that were aimed at stabilizing greenhouse gas concentrations at the level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with climate system have been turned into greenwashing. And this is something that we all live now and experience. And the result that in the last 30, 50 years, as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has recently stated in the assessment report 6, AR6, is that 1.5 degrees Celsius will be reached in the early 2030 in all emission scenarios considered, except the highest emission scenario for which the 1.5 degrees Celsius will be even earlier. In fact, the World Meteorological Association organizations thinks that we have already passed that. So the truth is that the Earth or the planet is set on a global average temperature rise, an increase of 3.2 to 5.7 degrees Celsius. The truth is that by signing the Paris Agreement in 2015, we celebrated and continue celebrating, being goaded into commemorating humanity's peril. Commemorate that Mother Earth, our common home, becoming our bleak house of extinction. Accepting, aiding, and abetting, making the world unlivable. Not only that we accept this incineration of our common home, but accepting that we are part of their industrial waste. So the global South climate reparations struggle is a continuum of the struggle of the colonized against their extinction. Their past, their current enslavement, subjugation, and the appropriations of their land, wealth, and atmospheric space, and their right to development and dignity. Climate reparations and climate justice are interlinked, and they are in essence about saving our common home. This planet in which we have lived and have thrived against the scourge of metabolic drift. The marsh and the expansive marshes of injustice and the deluge of inequality in every inch across the world. I think if we want to describe this century, it is the century of injustice and inequality and poverty across the world. Climate reparation, therefore, at its core, are about a rejection of a civilization bent on devastating humanity in its insane pursuit of growth, economic growth mean? Is search for staggering profits, and as the speaker before me said, impossible hubris of controlling nature. And that's not all. The Global South's struggle for climate reparations has equally, as she rightly said, it's Andrew Johnson's denialism. It has its Confederate flag bearers and powerful power blocks that refuse the Global South claim for climate reparations. And this club is, let's put it in clear terms, is the leadership of the G7 heads of states, the global North investment and industrial complexes, and I mention this because of the fact that Scotland, Wallonia, last year, no, in the conference, have for the first time in mankind's history, declared the acceptance, the principles of the climate reparations, and they put over $1 million in support of that effort. That's very remarkable. It's an act of solidarity with the Global South, and it is commendable. But it must be critically extended to a true climate justice leadership. And I want to remember to remind you here of our roles individually in advancing this. Lord Anthony Gifford, the prominent anti-apartheid lawyer, once said, "I do not have to be a woman to campaign for women's rights. And I do not have to be black to talk about racism." Compare that to the American government and House of Representatives position on reparations. Since 1989, the House of Representatives has been going through this, what they call HR 40. HR 40 originally presented by a representative of the House called John Conyers, is a bill about reparations for the descendant of African American slaves. The bill never moved to the floor of the House till now. Add to this two other small and very relevant factors. There are only two occasions in which reparations have been given. One, by the German government for the Jews, the consequence of the Holocaust. The second, the British Empire and the French government giving reparations to slave owners, but not to the slaves. British government reputedly gave the equivalent of $2 billion to the slave owners in the Caribbean. So reparations, climate reparations, are about those violations. They are about turning and repairing the Holocene into an unlivable planet through wanton industrialization and exploitation. So reparations, climate reparations, are not aid or charitable act to the vulnerable and the wretched. There are remedies to the massive harm and persistent damage to the habitat and the living conditions of billions of the peoples of the global South. The factual and the legal basis for climate reparations are embedded in international law, which determine that any acts that cause or sufficiently contribute harm constitute wrongfulness. These transgressions, therefore, are in essence criminal and impose obligations for reparations aimed at fully repairing material harm and damage that's caused. So they are restitution and compensation, and equally aimed at cessation and non-repetition of such offenses. This matters because in the environment or in climate change, reparations are meaningless without the being part and parcel of the effort to address climate destruction. If you want to measure it, if you want to see the demonstrable facts about this, consider this. The global north has caused 85% of all CO2 emissions which have brought the current crisis. Two, IPCC in its A6 report, AR6 report, states the following: it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, oceans, and land since around 1750. Widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, oceans, psychosphere, and biosphere have occurred. And since 2011, concentrations continue to increase, reaching annual average of 410 ppm for carbon dioxide. Land and oceans have taken up near constant progression of CO2 emissions. Globally, about 56%. from human activities over the past 6 decades with regional differences. And since 1850, each of the last 4 decades has been successively warmer than the decade that preceded it. These constitute the legal basis for reparations, because we live through that damage, that devastation, day in, day out. Billions of mothers and children live through that devastation. IPCC, and this is a group of scientists, states or adds further that the scale of recent changes across the climate system as a whole and the present state of many aspects of the climate system are unprecedented over many centuries to many thousands of years. Human-induced change is clearly affecting weather and climate extremes in every region across the globe. So that Annex 1 countries, developed countries, are responsible for climate destructions is a fact. And the call and demand for climate reparations is thus just. Thank you.
Thank you, Lumumba. That was very powerful and very sobering. So I think we need to take your words and reflect, but then also turn them into action. So thank you very much for that. I'm just now going to hand, talking of taking words and turning them into perhaps forward-looking actions that we can take, or more things that we may be able to do. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Dan, who's going to just give us a kind of short summary of where we're at in global justice now in terms of thinking about this issue. So Dan, hand to you.
Great. Can you hear me okay? Great. Okay, well, yeah, thank you, Lumumba and Nicola, for both your presentations. Yeah, a huge amount for us to kind of think through from both of them. And I think really useful for us all really to think about the kind of, first of all, the kind of the different interpretations and definitions of what reparations can mean. But also the, as the numbers kind of highlighted, the urgent call really that reparations is a historical issue, but it's also something that's kind of very much in our present and future as well. So I mean, I guess in a way I'm here to say how we're going to put this into action to an extent, but we certainly don't have kind of everything planned and mapped out fully yet. And like Liz said at the start of the event, we're still here and plan on listening and learning ourselves about kind of how reparationists around the world think we can be of most help to their movements as much as possible. But there are certain demands and parts of this story that I think we can help with, at least in the short term. And one of them, I guess, in a way, sort of starts in Glasgow. Well, it doesn't start in Glasgow, but Glasgow last November is a key point in the story, and that's the story around finance for loss and damage. So this is a type of finance discussed within UN processes like COP. Countries from the global south have been calling for loss and damage finance for a number of years, at least 3 decades. And specifically, that would be a kind of form of compensation for the damages that countries are suffering at the minute due to climate change. As Lumumba says, countries in the global south are by and far not the biggest polluters in the world, and they haven't contributed most to climate change, but they are suffering quite large economic losses as a result. So there's a strong call for compensation, but also crucially attached to that, really for rich countries to sort of admit the role that they've played and to own up to having caused climate change. So last November, there's big demand from countries in the global south, the least developed countries and small island states, for this new type of finance. Crucially, countries want a kind of separate pot of money to be set up, because so far the other pots of money that countries have provided have not been managed very well at all, but also they're for different things, there to kind of slow down the impacts of climate change and help countries to adapt. Whereas this is kind of a deliberate form of compensation. But the US and the UK and other countries have deliberately blocked discussions of this loss and damage finance at numerous COP talks. And just a few weeks ago, they even tried to block Egypt from putting it on the agenda for COP27. So there's a role we can definitely play in that. We always try to take the lead from our allies in the global south and what they're campaigning on, and a big call this year is to stand in solidarity with them on the issue of loss and damage. So we have just last week kind of set up a new petition on that. It's great if anyone who hasn't already can sort of sign and share that. But it's also an issue that we'll be asking you to write to your MP about, I'm sure, in the coming months. And we'll have actions, we think, or we'll be taking part in actions in London, and I think probably in Glasgow as well later in the year. So sort of keep an eye out for that, but it's a good opportunity to get involved in that particular part of our work. And a sort of related point on that is specifically this idea that I think I've seen mentioned in the chat already about who do we make pay for loss and damage, and a lot of organisations organising around the idea of making polluters pay. So on the one hand, that can mean rich countries and governments in the global north contributing finance, but we're also particularly interested in making corporations pay for the damage they've done to the planet. That has the effect of providing a degree of compensation, but also it puts the blame firmly on their shoulders and identifies who has done the harm in the first place. So some groups are calling for kind of fossil fuel corporations, particularly the ones that are making record profits at the minute, to pay a very high tax on their profits, or even not a tax on profits, just pay a kind of a penalty to fund loss and damage. We're particularly interested in a minute actually in the role that financial institutions play, and some of you have probably heard us speak before about the role of some financial institutions and banks based in Scotland in the global south debt crisis. So that might include BlackRock, who've got an office in Edinburgh. So I'm going to move my cat. And other asset managers like Aberdeen Standard Investments. These banks have played a huge role in fueling the climate crisis and financing fossil fuels. So there is a case to be made for them to also be paying reparations. BlackRock, I think, released figures fairly recently, which show that if you applied it to the whole of their portfolio, they would have financed more carbon emissions in 2020 than the entirety of Australia. And Australia in that year emitted a lot more than the UK. So quite a very big contribution really to carbon emissions made by BlackRock. They are the world's biggest asset manager, so not every company will have that kind of impact, but certainly there's a case to be made for them to be contributing to these forms of compensation. But crucially, as Nicola said, I think we kind of started off with this idea that might be the entirety of our campaign, and that might be kind of what we focus on with this. But I think having spoken to a lot of activists who work in this area, and also having reflected back on what the climate justice movement was calling for 10, 15 years ago, we do see a need to kind of expand beyond just these kind of financial forms of compensation in thinking about what reparations might entail. So some of you may remember or have heard of something called the Copenhagen People's Agreement, which was a kind of a document put together by climate justice groups all over the world. In that, there's a kind of a big call, not just for compensation, but also for other things like transferring technology to the global south and opening borders and other means of kind of repairing some of the damage done by colonialism and climate change. And some of those things we already campaign on. We already do, we already have our campaign on debt cancellation. We already have been, talking about migration and open borders for a number of years. But we'll sort of really try and bring these together in terms of, I think, it being like a package of things that need to happen to respond to climate change. And I think really one last thing, which is quite an exciting and interesting way, I guess, for supporters to get involved in this campaign, is that groups in like every area of the country will have local examples of companies or corporations that have maybe played a big role in the climate crisis, or most likely have some kind of connections to slavery or British colonialism. Glasgow has a lot of connections to the slave trade. Like I said, we've also kind of done quite a bit of research around the kind of banks and fossil fuel companies that have that are based in Scotland and their connections to debt and fossil fuels. And also a lot of activists now, I know in Yorkshire and kind of southwest England, are sometimes picking up quite obscure companies that have not been heard of before, and highlighting how they're kind of having a very present day impact on the global south. So in Scotland, there's companies like INEOS or RWE, who we've talked about a bit before. These are some of Scotland's biggest carbon emitters, but not always, they're not, they don't have the same profile as Shell or BP. So yeah, there's kind of scope there for groups, I guess, to work with other campaigns, or maybe do a bit of research yourselves to kind of think about, how we might demand reparations from these companies